All right, I'd like to introduce Wolf Goerlich today. He's Advisory CISO over at Duo, and he's going to be speaking on design thinking for secure development. So Wolf, if you want to share your screen.
You got it. You see my slides?
Yep, looks good.
Life is good. All right. Thanks everyone for joining this session. You know, it is a shame not to be in person. It's also a little bit exciting because originally I went, man, CornCon sounds pretty cool, but there's no way that I can make it fit in my agenda. So it's a honor to be here with you all virtually today. I, as already mentioned, am Wolfgang Goerlich. I am over at Duo, where I focus in on, as an advisory CISO, in on zero trust, passwordless, the front end of identity and access management. We just wrapped up a session here before with machine learning, so I dabble in that a little bit as it pertains to authentication. But predominantly, I've been struggling with this thought for a while now, and a little bit over a year, about a year ago now, on a keynote at Circle City Con, I stood on the stage and I said, does security have a design problem? Do we have a design problem, right? Are our problems that we're facing today less about the security properties of the technology we can marshal, less about the controls that we can put in place, less about the things that we can tell people to do and the engineering feats that we can accomplish, and more about the experiences that we create for our communities? And I'm still struggling with it. I think the answer is yes. And what do we do about it is where I'm at now. So I want to give you an update and take you through that. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at these principles applied to secure development, which is part of my background. I've been doing development for many years. I ran a DevOps team for a while, did an open source SIM and open source covert channels project and PowerShell and a few other things. I don't think I've written code anytime soon or anytime recently, which is sad, and I won't be doing it anytime soon. But the concept of secure development is one where I think we can make a tremendous amount of stride due to the fact that everything runs software these days, as we all know, right? Everything we bought. I just bought some light bulbs, and they were immediately wanting to connect to my Wi-Fi. And I wasn't even trying to buy a smart light bulb. It was just, oh, there's a light bulb that looks like it. No, it's all wired in and, of course, running software. So let's talk a little bit about that. But first, I want to take you back to where I think everything went wrong. And that's where this amazing thing happened, where we decided that, hey, wouldn't it be great if we put people on the computers? I have pinpointed the exact point in time everything went wrong, and ladies and gentlemen, that would be the point. And it all started with this bad boy. This is the original mouse prototype by Doug Engelbart. Doug Engelbart was a futurist, was a genius. Watch his mother-of-all demos. One of the things that I loved about Doug Engelbart, especially coming on the heels of an AI talk, was his focus on intelligence augmentation. In other words, not AI, but IA. Not how can we make the machine smarter, but how can we make the machines make us smarter? And one of his first stabs at it was this lovely piece of wood, which of course you guys will all recognize as the mouse. Now he refined it. He made it better, right? He went through a series of steps, and eventually it did indeed look like a mouse, as we can see on the left. This thing on the right, you may be like, what is that? It's interesting from an innovation perspective, how the mental models of which innovators use dictate the way the innovators view their eventual innovation. In this world that Doug Engelbart lived in, he originally viewed mastering the computer like mastering a musical instrument. And therefore, the mouse was invented, and this chord control was invented as well to add more buttons. What was also fascinating is a 6 6-month course was developed by Doug Engelbart and his TAs to teach people how to use these two wonderful things to drive a computer. So great innovation, but also not exactly user-friendly. Xerox sees this, of course, about, this is the early 70s. Xerox is like, we need to put these everywhere. We're going to mass produce them. They hire a company to do some engineering. They come up with this design. It looks much more familiar to us in terms of old school mice. And there's a couple of things intriguing about this. One, it was very expensive. Xerox's mental model was a precision instrument, not a musical instrument, but a precision scientific instrument. And therefore, these devices were very expensive, costing more than most computers cost today. Also, you'll notice one of them is flipped up, and you'll notice the trackball is metal. That is important. Why? Because they had a weekly maintenance process. They actually had members of the janitorial staff on a weekly basis go computer to computer, disassemble the mouse, clean it, and then the engineering team would run it through a process to realign it to make sure that precision piece of equipment worked well. Of course, the mice that we all know today come from Apple, and oftentimes we give Apple the credit, right? Steve Jobs brought it, but what was intriguing about Steve Jobs is he didn't actually design the mouse. He saw it, of course, in Xerox, and he knew his computer needed one. But he's like, I don't know how to build a mouse. He hired a guy named Dave Kelly and team. And that team would go on to design the mouse. And the history of it is really fascinating. I won't get into it now because it'll probably bore you guys. But I'm reading about like, wow, they like measured the acoustics and the click feel. And they figured out like how users would use these things and how long it would take them to pick it up. And how do you make it more intuitive? And also, how do you lower the cost? The company that Apple hired to make the first mouse, which of course would go on and be the ancestor of dollar mice, was one that eventually turned into IDEO. And if you want to know more about design thinking, check out anything by IDEO. They have a whole course on this. It is a process of empathy. It's a process of defining the problem within how the user defines it, not how we define it, right? Is it a music instrument? Is it a scientific instrument? I don't know. Let's ask the user how they think about it, and prototyping and testing. In the world that I work in and Duo as part of Cisco, we also have a design thinking process that collapses these into a discover, define, explore stage, but fundamentally it's the same concept. And in my office, I actually have the IDEO poster hanging just to remind me to start with empathy and think about rapid prototyping. Now, what does this mean compared to technology? Well, think about it. Like the last time you had to do like an ITIL design, right? The 7-step ITIL process is looking at capacity and availability and continuity. Nowhere in there do they talk about the person using the system. Nowhere in there do they talk about the person perhaps misusing the system, the criminal, the adversary. Instead, they talk all about here's how we build for availability, here's how we make some. It's a very much an engineering process. It's a very much a Xerox process. And again, I think it's important to contrast Xerox versus Apple, engineering versus design thinking. And the result was amazing back in the day. The result was a $400 mouse at Xerox, which, you know, in those days, about 3 times over. So it's about $1,200 in today's money, turned into a $25 Apple mouse. Curiously interesting fact, by the way, the Apple mouse has stayed around $25 when you factor in inflation. It's about $75 today, which $75 in 2020 money is about $25 in that money. Also, 6-month test, forget it. No, we're doing 6 minutes. Anyone can pick this up and go. And this really, I think, highlights the power of design. This really, I think, highlights the power of thinking about how the people we use the technology will work with it, how the people we are building these experiences for will navigate it, and how to do cost control and much better solutions. Of course, it all begins with empathy, which is not something that we're very good at, right? It's not something we're wired into. The two parents of cybersecurity is technology, where I configure something and therefore it works, Hopefully, that's why so many of us got into it, right? We type in the code and it does what we say it will do. We wire it in, it just stays wired in. Computers don't walk off, they behave when we tell them to. And the other parent, of course, is the military, where you've got command and control, right? These two mindsets are not conducive for empathy. They're not conducive for securing something like DevOps. So let's talk a little bit about DevOps. DevOps is very easy to secure. I'm going to put up a slide. It's all you really need to know. All you need to do is do these things: code review, design review, code inventory, asset inventory, container security, cloud security, SaaS, DAST, ISC, SCA. Do change monitoring, FIM, because you never know what's going to happen with those file integrities. Do infrastructure vulnerability managing, RASP, WAF, and do a pen test, and you are all set. That's really all you need to know. If you're looking for DevOps security, you're all set. Feel free to hang out for the next half hour to talk about why it's not that easy. Because oftentimes when we look at these as a checklist, we look at these from an engineering perspective. When we look at these from an ITIL perspective, we're like, all right, we can do that. But any benefit of DevOps goes right out the window because now we've effectively shackled it to the floor. And I think this is seen time and time again. You can imagine a developer talking to her friend saying, hey, I'm going to go take a walk before sprint planning. And friend's like, yeah, that sounds fine. Oh, by the way, it might rain. And security, we know the answer. It's like, wait, I got this. I'm going to protect you from the rain. Don't worry about it. Here you go. And will that keep you dry? Absolutely. Is that conducive to a usable experience? Certainly not. By the way, quick shout out to the Uncomfortable who designed this umbrella and a number of the transition slides in this deck. If you want to see some really uncomfortable examples of engineering, industrial engineering, go take a look at them. But if we think about adding sec in DevOps, it's got to start with that empathy. So let's talk a little bit about empathy from a design perspective. There's really two directions. I know we all know the two wolves, but there is these two things inside that we got to handle. It's our developers, of course, who I'm sure are all happy and excited and engaged to work with a security team. But it's also the adversaries. And I believe my fundamental hypothesis is that the design thinking that works for the users is the same design thinking that works for the adversaries. Because humans are human, we share a common firmware, we share a common wetware, we have idiosyncrasies and cognitive biases. We're a whole bunch of biological hacks in a trench coat pretending to be human. And because of these things, I think these same concepts apply, but you have to apply them in opposite directions. Let's talk about what that means and what that looks like. First off, intentionally or accidentally, we're always creating experience. Every time we put in place a control, every time we ask someone to use multi-factor, we're creating an experience, right? Where they have to get their phone or get their token or whatever to authenticate. Every time we put in place a level of file encryption, we're creating an experience where they now have to decrypt that and whatnot. And I think what is important is that we think mindfully about how to design that experience. There's two fundamental ways that research shows that experiences are cataloged. One is the paths that people take, right? And the other is the choices they make. This is being studied by occupational and industrial psychology. Quick call, if anyone knows any industrial or industrial psych students who are looking for a master's program, or I'm sorry, master's thesis or research collaborator, please send them my way because I want to dig deeper into this. It's one of the things that I'm looking at in 2021. I want to work with some of the psychologists to really hammer this home. But paths they take, how do you measure those paths? You measure them by the number of steps. You measure them by the familiarity of each step. Is it easy to go to each step, or is this something new that causes me friction, that slows me down, that makes me think? And of course, the friction at each step as well. We talk a lot in security about, oh, we can't add friction. I'm going to challenge the fact about adding friction a little bit, but we do need to be cognizant of the friction. And along the same way with choices, the number of choices, the predictability. If I choose this road to take me to work, do I get there every single day? If I choose this tool, does it work predictably every single day? If I choose this option in Jenkins, can I have a predictability of each choice? It's really intriguing if you want to mess with someone, lower the predictability of choosing. Just by a couple percentage points, it greatly slows down how fast people are able to make choices and move from step to step. And finally, the cognitive load at each choice. How much thinking do we need to do? Cognitive load would be, effectively the friction that the choice incurs. Now, how do we apply these things? We apply them two ways. We apply them to make it easier on our users, and we apply it to make it harder on our adversaries. Now, I know it's like, yeah, that's just your opinion, man. I totally understand. There is a lot of psychology being done on this. I'd point you guys to Soups as a great source of information to dig into. And again, if you know any students who are like, man, I really want to figure out how I could use industrial psych to solve the problem of DevOps security, who would I talk to? Say, hey, by the way, heard this crazy guy at CornCon, here's his information. So let's talk a bit about one really good example of this. And it's still an Apple example. I'm not an Apple fanboy, but Apple has done more to give us design examples than so many other companies. Early days, we gave people phones and we said, thou shalt, and we locked the phone down and life was good. I remember having Blackberries and being able to put in passcodes and encryption and everything else. And then Apple comes out. Everyone wants an Apple, right? If you're the cool kid, you've got the Apple. And so there's this flight to BYOD. Now, the problem was most of the people were not locking their phone. It slowed people down. It added friction. It didn't get people into the device. There's a famous rant Steve Jobs has about how you shouldn't add the lock screen in anyways, blah, 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 blah. It's, we're trying to enable people and make them better. We need to, enable them to realize their highest aspiration. We get it. It was bad because people were walking around with unlocked phones and you could get in and do things. So Apple had this idea about adding a touch sensor, right? Which is Touch ID and now Face ID. And when they did it, they looked at how people were using it. They looked at the paths they're taking. They're picking up their phone, they're hitting the home button, and they're then browsing their apps. Pick up the phone, hit the home button, browse the apps. Pick up the home button, that is the familiar path that people are taking. They also looked at the defaults. Are we asking people to turn on PIN codes or not? How does that enrollment process look? And they ran through a bunch of, workflows and research projects, and they determined, hey, if we put this Touch ID sensor on the home screen, it's going to behave exactly like they're used to, right? We hit the home button, you open up apps, we go. And they did that. And they paired that very simple familiar path with a very smart default choice to say, hey, enroll your fingerprint. And within a year of the phone rolling out, the adoption of the lock screen went from around 20% to over 80% within a year. Why? Because it's simple, familiar, and they knew what to do. And at the same time, it was a much better security experience, as we all know, with Touch ID versus walking around with your computer or your phone unlocked. So when we talk about the paths they take, let's first look at the user side of things. And the user side of things we know is effectively the DevOps world, right? We build code, we design code, we've got a path determined. And we know if we don't do a good job from a experience perspective, we add friction in, the developers are just going to chew away right around and get their work done without engaging us. We also know the path the adversaries are going to take. There's many ways to do this. There's the kill chain and the attack path. But fundamentally, if we look at some threat modeling, if we look at the overall process, criminals do effectively the same path depending on the attack. And we know too, if we don't have good friction, if we don't have the right number of steps, if we don't have the things in the way, the attackers are going to Mission Impossible style into our apps, into our environments, and then we have a breach. So we can start thinking about all those different controls I mentioned earlier and where they go on the path. Now, the key thing is inserting those in a way that reduces friction of the insertion, right? So using automation, using better tooling, working with the people. We can talk about that in a little bit. But the point is, we want to insert security controls that are easy on DevOps, but are hard on attackers. And by looking at those two paths, we can start to see that a lot of security controls we roll out, attackers don't even care about, right? It's not on their attack path. It's not on their procedure. All it's doing is adding friction and pain to our developers. By contrast, there's a lot of controls we can put in place that are completely invisible to the developer that have tremendous stopping power. So when we plan this out, let's talk about life cycles of doing this and how to do this design process. Fundamentally, you start with the vision, you look at what the business is trying to achieve, what the security functions are you doing, what controls you have in place, and what that tooling looks like, and you plan out the implementation. This is the overall process. Oftentimes we want to jump right into the tooling. It's what's exciting, it's what's fun. Everyone wants a whole bunch of blinking boxes and wants to talk about the latest code scanners and latest tools. But if we really start thinking about the functionality and that workflow, right? The paths they're taking, the choices they're making at these different levels, I believe we can do better in tooling instead of just jumping right into go, oh yeah, it's simple, just deploy this. So for example, let's assume we're talking about SAST and DAST or interactive or software composition analysis. When we start looking at these tools, we want to start off by looking at the tool chain that the DevOps team is using. We want to look at their automation layer. We want to look at how to break the build. We want to have conversations about, should we break the build or should we just alert? We want to look for ways that these tools can be run automatically. We want to look at ways these tools can be launched from the automation layer without a lot of problems. And that's all on the usability side, right? We want to make sure that fundamentally we're reducing the attack surface and reducing the vulnerable lines of code that the criminals get in. And another side of that is also making sure that we're taking a look for misconfiguration. I find it really fascinating that as our code has gotten better, the likelihood of us making mistakes has also gotten significantly faster. So the attackers are moving from the hardened systems up the stack to where we're making these mistakes. So we're going to write a single line of code. When we write that single line of code, it's going to increase the attack surface. We want to pair additional controls to scan that and find things. Now, the security mindset is scan all the things, right? We will find all the things. We'll find all the problems. We will not be breached. We will let them know what we see. And of course, you talk to any developer team, and they are sometimes, surprisingly, less than pleased with that approach. So at this point, we start talking about the paths they take. We want to look at how they handle bugs, how they handle defects. We want to make security defects look just like any other security defect. We also, this is really key, only want to act on the defects that are known to be exploited by attackers when achieving their objectives. Now you're going to say, well, wait a minute. Isn't the whole idea about SAST and DAST that you'll find all the things that attacker could possibly do ever and make a big list and give it to developers and they fix it? Yes. Yes, it is. It is. But the reality is, I used to run an OWASP chapter. I was an early, very strong believer in the OWASP top 10. And I was really glad when the OWASP top 10 included misconfigurations, by the way. I believe that security is not the control. Security is the context, which you will find in the misconfigurations in the hosting infrastructure. But when we started with OWASP top 10, we thought, hey, if we just told everyone all the things they did wrong, they would fix it and life would be good. What we really found is year after year after year, it's like SQL injection and cross-site scripting, right? The main scanners on the market will find 1,000 things wrong. Of those 1,000 things wrong, only 10 of them actually matter. The trick in this world, when looking at the paths they take, our developers and our adversaries, is to find and surface those 10 things reliably and not talk about the 990 things that would just bury the developers in excess of work. that again goes back to that empathy, right? So we also can look at uniting code quality and security, right? The paths they take, much like, hey, I pick up my iPhone and I hit the home button and I go. Today, our dev team is looking at code quality. They've got TQM programs. It is a source of concern. We can bundle security, and I think it's absolutely important. We make security another defect just like any other defect. So it looks, feels, and operates the same. Another thing I say quite frequently is when work looks like work gets done. And that's just another way of saying when the path that they take looks like any other path, they're more likely to take it. It's familiar and it'll get done. So if we can do the same thing with the vulnerabilities we find, we have a much greater chance of securing our systems. All right, now let's talk about the approaches to security, the opposite side of things. From a criminal perspective, we talk about defensive development. We want to do a few different things, right? We want to make sure that we're doing threat modeling regularly, obviously. It is always intriguing, the functionality that we build and the things that we create that seem so simple, seem so obvious, seem so great, that then get misused, right? OAuth tokens right now are in the news because they're being leveraged as ways to get in systems. At the time, developers and the people who built the OAuth and OIDC standards were like, hey, this is great. This is great. We can pass around token. You know me, I know you. You can use this token to authorize the user, and we can create distributed, federated authorizations, and with OIDC authentication. Awesome. Well, I don't know that we necessarily thought through is all the great ways that this new experience for our users creates for criminals to pass around tokens and do things nefariously. Now, not to say that we didn't think that there are threat models and everything, but the point is that when we build these things, we stand them up. The people who are doing it don't necessarily think about what the criminals may be going through because we're thinking about it from the user's perspective, right? We've got a mental model, much like Doug Engelbart with his musical instrument. We got a mental model that an app is an app, but to a criminal, an app is a vulnerability that I'm using to pivot. We find those things with threat modeling. We find those things with abuse case development, with having someone who is focused on how the criminals think embedded in the DevOps team. And of course, we look for controls, we write codes and tests. And finally, we integrate the tests for those controls within the overall process. One of the more mature DevOps teams I've had the privilege to work with and partner with really took this to the next level and used the controls as a set of outcomes, much like you would use, I'm going to add stuff to a shopping cart, I'm going to add, your unit tests, right? They add it as a set of outcomes and they test against that. Why? Because they realized that if you have a control in place, that's great, but it doesn't always stay in place. Let's test and hammer on it. I think a good example of this is back to my umbrella story, right? You know it's going to rain. I was in Zurich before the world closed, before the great reboot. I love that term, by the way, the great reboot. I don't know who started that term, but it's such a good way of thinking about this pandemic we're on. And so before we turned it off and turned it back on again, I was in Zurich and I knew it rained in Zurich. And so I did my threat model, like I will bring an umbrella. I did not bring a concrete umbrella. I know better. I brought my umbrella. I brought my wife. We were going out to dinner. So we get in the car. We go to dinner. We get in the car, go out to the downtown, get out of the car. We walked maybe a half block and the sky's open. It's raining. And so I've got my threat model. It rains in Zurich. I've got my control. I've got an umbrella. This is the point where we shine, right? As security people, this is our moment. We've done our work. And that was the moment when my wife turned to me and goes, "Didn't you bring an umbrella?" Yes. Well, where is it? In the hotel. Well, fat lot of good it does us right now, right? Where's the control and you need it? I use this story just to simply illustrate the point that we put things in place. If we don't test them, we don't know if they're still effective. The other thing we need to remember is putting these things in place to increase the steps the attacker needs to take. We, for a long time, didn't know how many steps that was. Verizon in 2019 and 2020 put out their reports, some really good data that shows it's about 10, right? If we can increase the number of steps the attacker needs to take to 10 or more, we can cut the success of that attack in half. We can cut that success below 50%. So we want to add those steps where it counts and validate those controls to make sure they're actually effective. Now, when things go wrong, when there's an incident, when there's a breach, this is another area which provides for a really great feedback loop. When there is a response, we want to feed that back to threat modeling, just like we do with our pen tests, just like we do with our internal reports, for the teams that are running bug bounties, just like we do with bug bounties, and feed that back in so that we can open the aperture or close the aperture of the control. In this case, we're talking again about our code quality, SCA, IS test. So we open the aperture to look at more of the findings, because maybe there's a class of bugs that we thought were not a big deal until they started being attacked, or close it to make sure that we're really just focusing on the ones that matter. So we're acting as much as possible out of that space where it is adding steps to the attacker. And then doing that validation integration with incident response. I want to talk a bit about adoption, and then we will hit the conclusion and get you guys onto the next section by the top of the hour. I think the successful control, oftentimes we talk about in terms of defense in depth. How deeply have we stacked those controls? Right? How deeply have we lined them up so that no one can possibly get past them? But as we're seeing with the misconfigurations, as we're seeing with the unevenness of controls, as we're seeing with breach after breach of common things like EC2 buckets being left open and whatnot, it's less about how deep the security is and more about how widely it's adopted. There's a couple different tricks here to get controls widely adopted in general, and in particular with our DevOps team. The first one I want to talk about is, and this may sound strange, but making security actually something that is attractive. I want to take you back to 1929. In 1929, flying was new. We didn't have an Air Force in America yet. Pilots were our heroes. They were amazing. There were things they were doing. And the U.S. Army Corps contacted this guy named McCready, who worked with Bausch & Lomb, say, look, we need safety goggles. We need good safety goggles. We need something that will protect our pilots. And they came up with a design that you all will probably recognize today. And the design would be the Ray-Bans, right? The Ray-Bans, which had anti-glare and wouldn't fog up and would protect the pilot's eyes. Almost no one thinks of a Ray-Ban as a pair of safety goggles. It's just not the way we think, because Ray-Bans are cool, right? I mean, who doesn't want to wear a cool pair of sunglasses? Part of the reason they're cool is because they were used by pilots. Part of the reason they're cool is because some of our, back in the day, our celebrities like James Dean and Audrey Hepburn started wearing Ray-Bans, right? In movies like Rebel Without a Cause and Breakfast at Tiffany's. And suddenly I was like, wow, Ray-Bans are awesome. And so the adoption rate of what was formerly a security control, formerly a safety issue, went through the roof. In the security world, I had a similar experience with this back in the day, where it was very expensive for our users to use a certain piece of software. That certain piece of software had a multi-factor token. And because only the top dogs in our firm, the Audrey Hepburns and the James Deans of our company, had access to this, only they had access to the multi-factor authentication. A weird thing happened in that suddenly people wanted more of these multi-factor tokens. It became a status symbol to say, yeah, I'm also one of the big dogs who has this particular access. And you wouldn't think about it, right? Just like you wouldn't think Ray-Bans would be safety goggles, you wouldn't think a security token would be a attractive feature. My point here is, adoption of the security tool chain is the missing link. And to get it adopted, we need to first find our developers who are our Audrey Hepburns and our James Deans, and we need to get them on board, because those role models are going to make the security control more attractive, and also, back to the empathy side of things, help give us feedback as to whether or not the control is appropriate. So another example of this that was pretty snazzy, where the DevOps team adopted Zero Trust for their application workloads. They did it, why? Because they wanted to have a resilient application. If you're familiar with chaos engineering, they really were taking a chaos engineering perspective, and they're also thinking about chaos engineering not only as what bad stuff could come down the pipeline, but what bad stuff the criminals could do to us. So they adopt the Zero Trust architecture, and then they have a zero-day exploit on their perimeter. And because of the way Zero Trust worked, every time the criminals would break in, it was a Kubernetes controller. Every time the Kubernetes controller was breached, the criminals would deploy the tools and try to scan around. The environment recognized that that was unusual, that it wasn't trusted. They would detrust or deauth that Kubernetes controller. They'd run an Ansible playbook to erase it, reload it. And again, the criminals would try and get in. And this went on for several times before incident response was engaged. Why this is cool is because it was such a cool story internally that, much like Ray-Bans, much like my tokens back in the day, suddenly all the other DevOps teams were like, really? How are you doing that? How are you architecting your apps so that they're that resilient, so that even if someone is not accidentally but is maliciously messing with them, we can protect? And suddenly the adoption rate for the security control went through the roof. But that also comes to another point, right? In both the aviators and the Zero Trust story I just gave, we have a unique property in terms of who's working with us. And I first realized this when I was thinking about flying. If both of these examples are flying, I'm sorry, but I still miss the world, and I can't wait to CornCon 2021. To hopefully I'm on a plane to come visit. But I'm sure if you've flown anytime within the past couple of years, you've used luggage. Your luggage has wheels. Wheeled luggage is just the way we do things. I was really surprised to learn that we actually were landing on the moon and doing significant scientific achievements before the wheeled luggage was invented, before the wheeled luggage rolled out. And the reason was the wheeled luggage was a insight by a pilot called Robert Plath. So Robert Plath is like, look, this is terrible. I'm sick of carrying around my luggage. I'll put wheels on it. He comes up with this idea. He does a batch for himself, a batch for his friends. And again, these are pilots and stewardesses. These are the cool kids back in the 1970s and 80s. And suddenly everyone's like, well, yeah, how can the cool kids have that cool luggage? And everyone wants it, right? And what ends up happening is Robert Plath goes ahead and leaves being a pilot to form a roll-on luggage company. Now you may say, well, wait, no one ever thought to put wheels? Yeah, of course, people put wheels on luggage before we landed on the moon. There's another guy called Bernard Sadow who did it, but he was not a pilot. He was not the inside guy. He did not know how people worked. And so because he did not understand the ins and outs, the previous inventor made luggage that didn't get anywhere, right? And so my point here is we need good adoption. The controls need to shine to the people who matter, who are the influencers within the DevOps team. And also we need to make sure that we understand the person doing the job is really the right person to ask about how to improve the job. Fundamentally, good security is usable security. And we get to usable security by working closely with the DevOps folks. And again, starting with empathy. Final thoughts. Let's put a couple more links on the chain and bring all this together. Point number one I want to make, start with empathy. Good security is as little security as possible. Not security that's in the way of our users, but security that's in the way of the criminals. We can do that by designing for usability. I provided a framework earlier on how to do that, reducing the friction and reducing the effort for our devs. and designing for defensibility by increasing the effort by using, adding more steps, as we saw with the Verizon data breach report, adding more complexity, as I provided in the zero trust example, and really making for a unexpected, unusual environment for our criminals, adversaries, and our pen testers. We can weigh these things out. I don't believe that there needs to be this constant tug of war between the two. Point two, I want to leave you with. We want to find ways that we can secure without slowing. This comes from understanding our data and how it's being used in the environment. It comes from understanding our business activities and how people are using the technologies in our environment. So we know how the users are working. And in this case, of course, it comes from understanding the DevOps workflow. And at the same time, then threat modeling and adversarial path. So we know the path the good guys are taking, and we know the path the criminals are taking. And by knowing those two things, we can introduce security that hopefully does not stop the user. That's the worst case scenario. Does not slow the user. We can do that if we need to. And as a matter of fact, there's some interesting research, which I don't have time to talk about today, that shows that some amount of slowing is actually a good thing because it makes users feel that there is security, that they are protected. Is invisible to the user is where we're aiming. And there are certain cases where people put in place security that actually speeds up the user by getting out of their way, by providing smarter defaults. The iPhone example I gave earlier, I also know a DevOps team that built a smart package, a very secure package for the FedRAMP environment. And by using this package, they're actually able to decrease the amount of time it took from close to 2 years down to 6 months to deploy code. Significant increase in speed in that particular example, while also having a significant increase in security. So I would argue that friction isn't the problem. It just isn't. It is the thoughtless adding of security. 3, make sure we're securing in layers. We all know this, right? Look at the features to code the bugs. Look for the flaws in architecture and design. Make sure we're addressing all 3, using application security testing for bugs and pen testing and threat intel to focus our flaws. 4th, start with empathy. Think about design process. Think about it in terms of how people work and act. If there are issues we need to troubleshoot, we can work on it with education, better incentives, better investments. And this model, this 4 Eyes model, comes from Spencer Greenberg. Fernando Montenegro also had a great talk at Converge. So if you want to know more about using this as a diagnostic tool, I'd point you to them. Fundamentally, just remember every time someone picks up a mouse, right? This is where we went wrong when we introduced the mouse. Every time someone picks up a mouse, they're making a choice to either strengthen or lessen our security posture. By working with empathy and kindness, by working on adoption, we can really implement stronger security controls and more effective security controls. That is all I have for you guys today. If you want to continue this conversation and know more, here's my email address and my website where I blog on these topics.
All right, well, thank you. It was really great for you to come here in a pinch and fill in for the speaker that we had leave. And it was a great presentation. I think the audience really enjoyed it. So let me wrap up. And if you want, you can head over and chat with people in our Discord.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.